editor at getAbstract. In today's Get-Together session, we'll have the opportunity to talk with Professor Nancy Leys Stepan, Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University and author of the book Eradication. Welcome, Professor Leys Stepan.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you. And as before, our viewers will have the possibility to ask some questions. So our viewers, please post your question in the chat and we'll pick them up later on. Very well. So eradication. What was so groundbreaking about the discovery of pathogens like bacteria and viruses? Did it lead people to believe that once they knew what caused a certain disease, they could eradicate it? Did people believe if they found the right tools, like vaccines, for example, they could rid the world of those diseases?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. Could I just begin by prefacing my remarks and saying that I would like to explain how I'm using the term eradication. Many people use the word eradication to mean let us eradicate poverty, meaning let us reduce poverty. Whereas I am using the word eradication in my book in its 20th century public health sense to mean an absolute. That is, the reduction of the incidence of the disease worldwide to zero by means of some kind of human intervention or human method. Mm-hmm. And that is a very absolute or absolutist definition. You could distinguish it from elimination, which means the elimination of a disease from a particular region.
Yes.
For example, polio in the United States. And then they often use a third definition, which is extinction, which is to actually eliminate the pathogen itself, like the smallpox virus, which we have not extinguished. We have simply stopped transmission. So I wanted to just make first the remark that this is a very absolutist, rather definite definition of eradication. Now, what is the connection with bacteriology, for instance? Well, certainly bacteriology gave a much more precise, close definition of causation of a disease. It identified a disease with a pathogen, such as a bacterium. To that was added, at roughly the same time, late 19th century, early 20th century, the notion of a vector, something intermediate between a host and another host, which transmitted the pathogen, such as a mosquito. Mm-hmm. And it's the relationship between this bacteriological revolution, let's call it that, to include many other aspects like viruses and so on, was that it gave precision and introduced the idea of a specific link in the transmission process, the causation process. So it meant excluding things like socioeconomic determinants of disease, yes, but allowing you to focus on something that you could manipulate and manage in particular ways, particularly in the laboratory, to produce vaccines. So now then the question is, it was vaccine the crucial bit that led people to think of eradication? Well, that's actually an interesting question, because when Edward Jenner introduced for the first time the notion of vaccination in the 18th century, he very, very quickly predicted that one day his vaccine would eliminate smallpox from the world. So that was one of the very first definitions of eradication. However, we have to go to the early 20th century before the notion of eradication was really taken up in a serious way by things like the Rockefeller Foundation. And when they did not, in fact, depend on diseases that had a vaccine. They were particularly interested in things like yellow fever, which is a vector-transmitted disease. They thought that they could, by reducing the percentage of mosquitoes, they could control yellow fever. And eventually they thought they would be able to eliminate it. That's another story. But so the connection, yes, is there with the bacteriological revolution, but it is complex, as usual, a complex set of connections.
Yeah. And you mentioned that by focusing on the pathogens, people had something that they could control, because there are certainly other factors they didn't have the control over. And it was this idea of eradication was very popular among public health practitioners for quite some time. Is that right?
Yes, I would say that's probably right. I mean, the post-World War II eradication campaigns focused on yellow fever and malaria in particular, and then eventually smallpox. And they were enormous efforts. And if you had defined them not as eradication, but as control efforts, they were extraordinarily significant. But as eradication efforts, of course, as we know, only one succeeded, which was smallpox. But let's just go back a step. Mm-hmm. Malaria has, to this day, no vaccine. It has drugs, such as chloroquine, and before that, quinine. Yellow fever had no drugs and no vaccine until the 1930s. So therefore, it did seem rather sort of obvious, well, the weak link here is the mosquito. We do have insecticides that can deal with the mosquito. Why not focus our attention on getting rid of the mosquitoes, which is really the policy of under the malaria eradication program and under the yellow fever program. Right. Of course, they thought they could eliminate these diseases completely and found they couldn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that brings me to
Could I just add to that one thing more? If you think of Zika, chikungunya, dengue, these are all transmitted by mosquitoes. So I think that this vector theory has remained rather significant. And indeed, mosquito control is, unfortunately or fortunately, the tool that we really have to try and reduce the impact of Zika and dengue. Difficult to do, but necessary to do.
Absolutely, yeah. So, which brings me to the question, what does it take to eradicate a disease, and how can the chances of success be estimated? And of course, I'm sure our viewers would be interested in the question: would it be possible to eradicate the virus, a novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19 and which causes the current pandemic? Would that be an option at all?
Could I put that side? Sure. Since we've only eradicated one disease, so you might ask, was there anything about smallpox that gives us indication of which diseases can be eradicated? Mm-hmm. Well, smallpox, first of all, is easy to diagnose. Its clinical signs are fairly obvious. I mean, I could say a little bit more about that, but I'll just stick with that. It is transmitted person to person. As far as they knew when they started, it doesn't have an animal reservoir. There isn't virus being harbored, as it were, in animal populations, which would be very, very difficult to eradicate. Mm-hmm. They had a vaccine, our oldest vaccine. And they also had a number of political and economic factors behind them. This was the immediate post-war period. WHO had just been founded. It did provide expert knowledge. Smallpox was a well-established, known entity. Mm-hmm. There had been large-scale vaccination movements before 1948. Mm-hmm. So that when they undertook the eradication campaign, they encountered populations that already had a degree of immunity, even though the aim was to vaccinate 80% of the population. And to a certain extent, I would argue, given the fact that WHO is very much in the news right now, WHO did have a certain authority. This was post-World War II. Huge problems with displaced people. Epidemic disease was very much on the forefront of people's minds. And WHO did have expert committees that could draw up advice and protocols for what to do, which is rather different from today with the coronavirus. And yet, let's just remind ourselves that right until the very end, Henderson, who was leading the speeded up effort at the end of the smallpox campaign, himself doubted to the very end that they would be able to eradicate smallpox. Yeah. So we've done it once. And so if history is any model or any guide, I would say let's be a little bit hesitant to immediately rush to the idea that we can vaccinate. And on that point about the coronavirus, let's just take another example. Measles, very good vaccine. Why have we not eradicated measles? It is biologically and obviously in other ways a very plausible thing to do. We have never done it. In fact, of course, with anti-vaccination movements, measles was making a comeback. Mm-hmm. So you have to have a mix of biological, but above all as well, political and economic factors, resources, political will. And let's not forget that this was the Cold War, yet nonetheless there was enough cooperation across the political divides to achieve the end of smallpox eradication. And look where we are today with the divisions in the world. So I would say that smallpox is a very good example of the complicated nature of eradication. Maybe it tells us that eradication is not the right goal to set. On the other hand, when you say to people, we're going to eradicate, it does muster a certain kind of political enthusiasm and goal setting. But on the other hand, the reality of history is it is a very difficult goal to set.
Absolutely. And could we even say that those other eradication campaigns failed? Would you call it a failure? Because you mentioned a couple that where the hope certainly was that we would eradicate those diseases successfully, but we haven't yet. Did they fail, or is there still hope?
Well, let's just take a few examples. Some of them, most of them failed. Some of them are still ongoing, and we still have hope, but the goal seems to be always just over the horizon. In the case of yellow fever, like most eradication campaigns, most medical knowledge is incomplete, and medical knowledge was incomplete in the case of nearly every eradication campaign. And this could sort of span a spectrum of possibilities. So in the case of yellow fever, one of the things that they didn't know was that yellow fever has an animal reservoir. There is an etiological cycle that does not involve the urban mosquito that they were focusing their attention on.
Yeah.
And once they realized this, they realized they could not eradicate yellow fever. You can control yellow fever, but you can't eradicate it, short of eradicating all the animals in the forests and so on where they live.
And this knowledge was just not available in the beginning, right?
Well, it was not available partly because, like so often, they had in their head a different model, the wrong model.
Yes.
They had the idea that there was only one vector of yellow fever, that yellow fever was primarily urban, and that's where the Aedes aegypti mosquito had evolved and adapted to. Yeah. And in that way, it was a very good model for controlling urban yellow fever, but it wasn't a good model for eradicating yellow fever, because meanwhile you had this sylvatic cycle. And so now in the case of malaria, there were many, again, incomplete knowledges. So that, for example, the ecology of malaria is very complex. It's often quite local. And yet what you had in the eradication model was the same process, the same model, if you like, for everywhere. And again and again, they were challenged by much more local problems about mosquitoes behaving as we thought they should. And you also had, of course, since it was a worldwide effort, you had lots of national programs running out of DDT, running out of resources, running out of manpower, disagreements between regional heads of WHO and the center in Geneva, and so on and so forth. So it's such a mix of medical, scientific, political, social, economic. And as is so often the case with these kinds of campaigns, the model was basically medical and scientific, or if you like, biological, and it tended to exclude the social determinants of disease, migration of population, work conditions, and so on and so forth.
And I think
so. These are very complex diseases, very complex diseases to have taken on. I mean, it's a bit of a surprise that malaria was the first disease chosen after World War II to eradicate, given that it had a long history of scientists knowing full well that it was one of the most complex diseases in its socio-economic and biological determinants. Yeah. So one of the famous malariologists said, malaria is many, many diseases, not one disease.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about this complexity and about the science and the medical side and then all the other factors involved, that reminds me on the current situation with the pandemic and with COVID-19. So it's spreading around the globe and it's affecting people. And while this happens in more or less the same way, we see that people in different countries and regions and territories deal with the situation quite differently. So likewise, how do political and economic and social forces support or hinder the eradication efforts in different places? I guess maybe there's a parallel between those.
I think there is. I mean, I think we shouldn't forget that this pandemic is of a novel virus, and whereas eradication campaigns did not tackle and aim to eradicate a novel virus. So many things are unknown about this virus that people are, as it were, making it up as they go. And what are they finding they can rely on? The most ancient of public health measures, flight, travel brought it, and people are fleeing it. They're doing like I am. I'm, moved out of the city into the rural area. Then quarantine, isolation. These are the old-fashioned techniques that are available. Whereas with eradication campaigns, there at least was a belief that these are established diseases. We've been living with them for a very long time. We now have the science and the means to tackle them. We have protocol. We think we know what we're doing. And on the whole, to a certain degree, they did know. But they also didn't know many things. And so the goal was, yes, exactly. So the goal was thwarted. But I think it's important to make sure that there is a distinction drawn between what eradication aimed to do and what we could aim to do with this coronavirus. I think it's premature to say we can vaccinate. And I always have in the back of my head that the example I just gave of measles. We have good vaccines for certain diseases, but we have never tried to eradicate them. Why? Because it's difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very difficult.
And I have just read, I think in some journal, they said that there are like more than 70 vaccination programs running right now for, to find some vaccine that helps in the current pandemic.
And we've no idea
approaches that were never tried before. So I'm very curious to see if there's so much effort, will it be any different from what people tried before? Because the pressure is so high right now. But maybe there's a limit on how you can speed things up and what you can do and what you can't. Yeah.
I feel as though I don't have any authority any more than you do, perhaps, to answer. I mean, I'm not a specialist at all on vaccine production. It does seem to me very ambitious to produce a vaccine in such a hurry, and one doesn't want to have important steps skipped. It's too risky. And I'm constantly reminded of, well, what is the fastest time we ever managed to get a vaccine? So let's just say yellow fever virus was identified in 1900. It was actually isolated in the 1930s, and they produced a vaccine 10 years after it was isolated. It was isolated in the 1920s. 10 years later, we had 17D, the Rockefeller Foundation's own vaccine. The French had got a different vaccine from a different strain of yellow fever, which worked pretty well for a long time. That's pretty short, actually. But it's, 10 years, not a year. And I can't quite see a vaccine being produced in such a short time. But I'm not, as I said, not an expert on vaccine production.
In the absence of vaccine, of course, there are measures being taken. Governments take measures. You mentioned the containment, and you called it the old-fashioned method which people are using right now. One more question that I would like to ask you is, how can governments earn the public compliance, especially with the containment measures? How much surveillance is necessary? And I'm asking this because in your book you say at one point you say shifting people's behavior is often considered the hardest thing to change at all. That's why I'm asking.
Yes, that's a very, very good question. It's noteworthy that the figure in my book that I use as a kind of narrative device, I follow the career and the work of the arch eradicationist of the 20th century, is a man called Fred Soper, who worked for the Rockefeller Foundation and then after the war headed the Pan American Health Organization. He famously said, "You cannot do eradication in a democracy." That is, he was used to a mandatory application of policies, such as, in case of yellow fever, they would send in the mosquito brigades into people's houses, and then if they found larvae after a certain number of inspections, they would fine the individual for not clearing the larvae from water containers that they used to keep their water supplies when they had no piped water. So you sort of, as it were, put the burden of success in this regard on the individual person, often very poor person, on the people.
Yeah,
So how do, yes, and that's not something we're going to do now. I mean, it is worth considering how authoritarian a country has to be in order to get compliance, especially in a country like the United States, where, frankly, we have a president who's anti-science, is odd in that regard. We have strong religious groups who are not interested in science and things that, do not believe in science. We don't have a compliant culture. We don't have a trusting culture. We don't trust people don't trust the government. Whereas you have other cultures where that degree of trust is much, much higher, like Sweden, I imagine. And you do have compliance because that's a deeper part of the political culture. So these things do make a huge difference to success or failure in public health policies. I mean, the anti-vaccination movement is a very interesting example of how trust was lost for not very good reasons, and as a consequence, people don't want to use the MMR vaccine for their children.
Yeah.
And of course, what they're depending on is the herd immunity of the community. They're depending on other people having the vaccine, but not them, their own children.
So in this sense, how important is it for people to be educated about science-based approaches and to improve public health? And I guess what you're saying is this is quite crucial.
Well, it is crucial, but it is also very, very difficult. I mean, you and I, no doubt, have been following, like everybody else, all the detailed sciences you can about the coronavirus. Yet I'm not a virologist. I can't follow the mathematics of all the modeling and epidemiological models. I'm happy, like everybody else, to toss out words like the R naught, antigen, antibody, flatten the curve. We all have this vocabulary, but how much do we really enter into the true depths of the scientific knowledge? Then you have politicians who tell us that they're relying on science, some of them anyway. How much of that is based on actual real understanding of the scientific information they're receiving, and how much is a kind of protection for what are essentially political decisions, where you put the economy ahead of safety or whatever.
And you said it before, we have to decide on the way, as we understand more about this. We
have to try. And I think also the public often has a rather simple idea about what science is like. Scientists are not unitary. They disagree with each other. They use different calculations. They use different models. Look at the epidemiological models. They are based on different assumptions, often different use of data.
Yeah.
They are not meant to be predictive in the sort of that sense. They're meant to be a sort of provide us possible scenarios. And we turn to the scientists, and the politicians say, well, I'm relying on the science. Well, whose science and which science? How do we convey? Politicians are not trained in the sciences, most of them. How do we need the role of public communicators, I feel. We desperately need people who are doing what you're probably doing.
Bridging the gap somehow, yeah. And
yeah, I think it's very
before, in relation to the vaccines, you said something like it's dangerous to skip steps, and I think that holds for other scientific studies as well. With a peer review process and everything, and there are lots of studies out there, and it's a different situation because to do it right, we need the time, but we don't have the time. So somehow people try to speed things up, and that's so difficult.
It is difficult, and it is being done right now with the vaccines. They are definitely skipping some stages. I mean, some suggestions are sensible. I mean, it's one thing to get a vaccine; it's another to be able to actually produce it in millions and millions of doses. And that's got to be thought out now. You've got to be able to manufacture in large quantities, even though you don't have a vaccine. And then there's the whole question. And then there's the whole question of equitable distribution of these vaccines. again and again, I'm struck. For example, why do we continue to have yellow fever epidemics in Africa? Why is the vaccination rate so low? We have a good vaccine for yellow fever, yet we have very, very low levels of vaccination in places where population is at risk. So pinning hope on your vaccination is too simple. You have to have, there are so many other factors that go into its possibilities, political, economic, equitable, questions of equity, access, and manufacturing capability and so on.
So that's a bigger picture, absolutely, And then I know there are many more questions that we could discuss, but we also want to give our viewers the possibilities to ask some question, and some came in. May I just read you one of those?
Of course.
There is one question coming from Greta. So you're saying vaccines and pesticides will help eradicate diseases and mosquitoes, which spread some of the disease. But at what cost are these pesticides to our environment and vaccines to our health? So the immunization schedule for children now keeps growing yearly, as does our rise in cancer, autism, and many others autoimmune health issues. Do you think there is a correlation? My grandma said there was none of this stuff around when she was a child.
Well, that's somebody who is anti-vaccination. What I'd rather address is the first part of that question, because I did not, in fact, say that I think insecticides wildly used against mosquitoes is a good idea. On the contrary, one of the things that prevented the malaria eradication program from succeeding is insect resistance to the insecticides.
Okay, so it's great that you can clarify.
The wide use of insecticide was really both, fundamental to the program and yet the problem of the program. What I was only just trying to say is that mosquitoes, vectors in many diseases, dengue, Zika, yellow fever, malaria, remain a place where you can, in fact, devise much less polluting insecticides, much more careful use of insecticides, or other techniques. And here again, we're reaching for new technologies, such as bioengineering mosquitoes that don't transmit the virus. There are problems with that too, because it runs a risk of disturbing the local ecology. They run the risk also of not being evaluated properly by the public, because they're the ones that's going to actually live in the area where you release these mosquitoes. But the people are searching desperately for alternatives to the kind of wild, abundant use of insecticides like DDT, which after all was banned in the United States for agricultural use in 1972. Obviously, other bad insecticides came to replace it, but nonetheless, we have to think of how we can tackle the mosquito. There's something else to be said here, which again addresses the first part of this person's question, I think, is that from the very early stages of the 20th century, with the development of these new technologies based on bacteriology and virology and so on, there would be a tendency to, as I said, exclude from considerations the other kinds of determinants of the disease, socioeconomic ones. So let's just take Zika or yellow fever. It greatly affects people who are the poorest because they don't have basic sanitation. So instead of investing in piped water, you go into people's houses and say, put some DDT or equivalent on those larvae. And so we've invested in public health technologies, but we haven't invested in the basic infrastructure of
the root cause.
That's the tendency that's there in the early 20th century, and it's remained fundamental to modern public health.
Absolutely. I'd like to ask to take one more question, which came in from Paula, who asks, what lessons can we learn from historical education campaigns to fight the current and the future pandemics that we could be faced with? Are there any lessons that we can take from them?
My lesson is a rather sort of sad one, which is the lesson is that it's really hard to eradicate. And maybe the goal shouldn't be eradicate, but should be control. We obviously are going to do everything we can to stop the transmission of the coronavirus. I think, however, the history shows eradication is an absolute, and the world is and depends on perfection, and when the world is not perfect. And so I think we're going to have to live with the coronavirus, but at a much greatly reduced level, and we will probably produce a vaccine, which we hope would be great if it gave lifelong immunity. But even with a good vaccine, I suspect we're going to live with the coronavirus for quite a while.
And do you think it could probably come back in a seasonal fashion as well? As, I mean, obviously we don't know yet, but
well, if you mean by season entirely to do with temperature, I'm not so sure we know the answer to that. But I do think it'll come back. Yes, I think when we relax the controls, we will circulate. After all, many coronaviruses are already circulating in our population, are endemic in our population already. They're not very severe, but nonetheless they're there. So I suspect this will happen with this coronavirus.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yes, and I know there are many more questions we could discuss, and it's really absolutely great to have you here today. Unfortunately, the time is up. Thank you so much, Professor Leys Stepan, for the discussion and for sharing your expertise today. And
well, thank you for asking.
Yeah, that it was great having you, and thank you everybody for watching. Thank you. Take care and be safe.
And be safe yourself. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.